You can sit down to a bowl of oatmeal with blueberries and a glass of orange juice at 7 in the morning. Feel completely satisfied. Congratulate yourself on being the kind of person who starts the day responsibly. And in that exact moment, your body is processing that meal in a way that accelerates vascular aging, locks your fat cells shut for the next several hours, and triggers a low-grade inflammatory response that compounds silently over years before it ever appears on a blood panel your doctor orders. The problem is not the blueberries. The problem is not the oatmeal. The problem is the time. And after 60, the time problem is not a minor inefficiency. It is the central organizing mechanism behind why metabolic decline, weight gain that resists every intervention you try, and the specific pattern of aging that most people chalk up to just getting older, why all of that accelerates quietly every single morning. By the end of this, I am going to walk you through what happens inside your body in the 6 hours after a typical breakfast, stage by stage, in enough detail that you will never look at your morning routine the same way. And I am going to give you a specific three-part framework. I call it the noon reset, grounded in Nobel Prize-winning research that costs nothing to implement and changes the entire biological sequence of your day. But first, the invisible villain. Because there is one, and it is one you have been colliding with every single morning, and nobody in mainstream nutrition has fully explained what it is doing to your body at this stage of life. Your cortisol level peaks 30 to 45 minutes after you wake up. This is called the cortisol awakening response, and it is one of the most robustly documented phenomena in human endocrinology. Cortisol is your primary alertness and stress hormone, and it spikes hard in the morning for a specific purpose. It signals your liver to release stored glucose into the bloodstream so that your brain has fuel before you have eaten anything. This is elegant evolutionary biology. It got human beings out of their shelters and moving before the first meal of the day. Here is the problem. Cortisol and insulin are biological antagonists. Cortisol suppresses insulin receptors. Specifically, it reduces the sensitivity of the receptor sites on your muscle and fat cells that insulin needs to dock with in order to move glucose out of the blood. When cortisol is elevated, your cells are, in practical terms, partially resistant to insulin signal. The door is partially blocked. Now add age to this picture. After 60, baseline insulin sensitivity has declined considerably compared to midlife. The mechanism is largely structural. Skeletal muscle mass, which is your body's primary glucose disposal organ, the tissue responsible for absorbing the majority of blood glucose after a meal, has been slowly declining for years. Muscle mass typically peaks in the late 20s to mid-30s and begins measurable decline after 40, with the rate of loss accelerating significantly after 60, particularly without resistance training. Less muscle means fewer receptor sites, a smaller biological sink for incoming glucose, and a pancreas that has to compensate by producing more insulin just to achieve the same blood sugar clearing effect it managed easily a decade ago. Think of your glucose disposal system as a warehouse loading dock. At 40, you had 20 loading bays and a full crew. At 60, you have 12 loading bays and a smaller crew. The same number of trucks, glucose molecules arriving from a meal. The warehouse does not refuse delivery. It backs up. And the institutional response to the backup is to add more supervisors, more insulin, rather than to solve the structural problem of the shrinking dock. When you eat at 7 in the morning, you are directing a truck convoy to a loading dock that is already congested with cortisol traffic, staffed by a crew that is smaller than it used to be, in a facility that the circadian clock has not yet fully opened for the day. The backup is not occasional. It is happening every single morning. Let me walk through the stages in sequence because the downstream consequences of this collision are not limited to blood sugar. They reach your cardiovascular system, your brain chemistry, your gut microbiome, your overnight repair processes, and ultimately the speed at which your body ages at the cellular level. Before the meal, the cortisol awakening response has fired. Blood glucose has already risen from your liver's overnight glycogen release. If you interpret the alertness and mild edge that comes with the cortisol spike as hunger, you are misreading the signal. What most people experience as needing breakfast immediately in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking is cortisol driven neurological activation, not true physiological hunger. Genuine hunger, the kind produced by depleted energy stores, and the hormonal signaling driven by rising ghrelin, develops over a longer fasting window, typically beyond 14 hours in a metabolically flexible adult. Someone who ate dinner at 7 in the evening and wakes at 6 in the morning has been fasting for 11 hours. That is not long enough for real depletion hunger to arrive. This misreading is not accidental. The food industry has spent decades engineering breakfast foods for maximum convenience, portability, and palatability, and has positioned these products precisely at the moment of the cortisol spike, when the line between alertness and appetite is blurriest, and when food consumption is most automatic. The granola bar on the counter, the yogurt you can eat standing up, the drive-through coffee with the muffin. These are not random. They are positioned within the physical and temporal environment of maximum cortisol-driven craving. This is what I mean when I say that most health mistakes are not primarily biology problems, they are environment problems. The environment around your morning has been carefully engineered to extract behavior from you at the moment your biology is most susceptible. Understanding the mechanism is what breaks the automation. Now, the meal itself. This is the insulin flood stage. A typical healthy breakfast in 2026, the kind that scores well in popular nutrition frameworks, the kind featured in wellness magazines and recommended by hospital dietitians who have not updated their handouts in 15 years, might look like this: instant oatmeal with a drizzle of honey and some berries, a glass of orange juice, maybe a slice of whole grain toast with peanut butter. This meal is not junk food. Every component has been individually validated as a health food by someone with a credential. And the glycemic load of this meal, consumed at 7 a.m. in a body with cortisol suppressed insulin receptors and reduced muscle mass, is a metabolic event that your pancreas was not built to handle gracefully at this stage of life. Orange juice deserves a specific moment because the distance between its reputation and its metabolic reality is significant. A standard 8-ounce glass contains approximately 26 grams of sugar. The fiber present in a whole orange, the structure that slows glucose absorption and gives the fruit its legitimate nutritional value, is removed when the orange is pressed. What remains is concentrated fruit sugar in liquid form, with a glycemic index in the range of 50 to 60, comparable to a regular soft drink. The vitamin C is real, the polyphenols are real, but the blood glucose impact of drinking orange juice in the morning is also real, and in a body over 60 with the insulin dynamics already described, that impact is amplified rather than absorbed efficiently. Within 30 minutes of this breakfast, blood glucose spikes. The pancreas reads the spike and releases insulin, but cortisol is still elevated from the awakening response. The insulin receptors are partially blocked. The pancreas overshoots. It releases more insulin than this meal would require in a younger body or in a later in the day context. Researchers call this compensatory hyperinsulinemia, and it is not a minor variation on normal. It is a meaningful metabolic overshoot with two immediate consequences. The first consequence is fat lockdown. Insulin is the master switch between two metabolic states your body can operate in: glucose burning mode and fat burning mode. When insulin is elevated, the enzyme responsible for breaking down stored fat, hormone sensitive lipase, is actively suppressed. Your fat cells receive a clear molecular signal: store, do not release, not gradually, not partially. Insulin elevation is a binary instruction to fat tissue. Every minute your insulin remains elevated after that 7 a.m. breakfast is a minute your body cannot access its stored fat reserves for fuel, regardless of what you ate or how clean your diet appears to be. The second consequence unfolds over the next 90 minutes to 2 hours. After the overshoot, insulin begins to clear. Blood glucose drops. In many adults over 60 who eat a high glycemic morning meal, it drops below the pre-meal fasting baseline, a state called reactive hypoglycemia. The counter-regulatory mechanisms that stabilize blood sugar during a drop, glucagon secretion from the pancreas, epinephrine from the adrenal glands, are less rapid and less precise after 60 than they were at 35. The dip feels like a crash, fatigue, difficulty concentrating. A specific craving for carbohydrate or caffeine. This is your body's emergency signal that fuel is getting scarce, even though your fat cells, which contain the equivalent of weeks of stored energy reserves, are right there, sealed shut by the residual insulin that has not yet fully cleared. This cycle, spike, overshoot, reactive drop, craving, repeating every 2 to 3 hours, is what most people over 60 have normalized as simply how they feel during the day. Slightly foggy mid-morning, a genuine need for something sweet after lunch, a low energy window around 3 in the afternoon that only coffee or a snack seems to resolve. The solution almost everyone reaches for is more food, more caffeine, more sugar, which restarts the cycle rather than breaking it. Now, the mainstream betrayal, because this is where I need to be direct about who told us to eat this way and what that cost us. We have been told that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, that eating in the morning jumpstarts your metabolism, that skipping breakfast leads to overeating later and slows your calorie burning machinery. These claims were not generated by neutral scientists working from first principles. They were seeded by the breakfast food industry in the early 20th century. John Harvey Kellogg was among the pioneers, and embedded in clinical nutrition orthodoxy through decades of industry-funded research, industry relationships with dietitians, and industry messaging embedded in public health guidelines. A 2019 investigation published in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, one of the world's most respected peer-reviewed publications, specifically examined the influence of cereal company funding on breakfast research and documented that industry-funded studies were nearly 4 times more likely to report favorable outcomes for breakfast consumption than independently funded research. 4 times. That is not a rounding error. That is a systematic directional bias that shaped what your doctor, your nutritionist, and every magazine you have ever read was telling you about how your morning should begin. The independent data tells a more complicated story. A randomized controlled trial published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2014 by researchers at the University of Alabama at Birmingham directly tested the metabolism hypothesis that eating breakfast accelerates resting metabolic rate compared to skipping it. They randomized adults who normally ate breakfast to skip it and adults who normally skipped breakfast to eat it and measured outcomes carefully. The result, eating breakfast had no measurable effect on resting metabolic rate compared to not eating it. The mechanism the industry had been selling for decades was simply not in the data when examined without industry involvement. What the independent research has been consistently showing for at least 15 years is that meal timing relative to your circadian biology matters far more than whether breakfast exists or doesn't, and this is where the science becomes genuinely interesting rather than just depressing. In 2017, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine went to Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young for their work mapping the molecular machinery of circadian clocks. What they demonstrated in rigorous detail is that virtually every cell in the human body contains its own internal clock, synchronized to a roughly 24-hour cycle, and that this clock governs not just sleep and wakefulness but also metabolism, hormone secretion, immune function, DNA repair, and the rate at which cells age. Your liver has a clock. Your pancreatic beta cells have a clock. Your gut epithelial cells have a clock. And these clocks govern, at the molecular level, when those tissues are optimized to process nutrients. Your body processes food differently depending on what time of day it arrives. This is not a metaphor or a general tendency. This is molecular biology, documented with precision. The same meal, identical calories, identical macronutrient composition, generates a measurably different insulin response, a different triglyceride response, and a different inflammatory response depending on when it is eaten. Research in chronobiology has shown that a standardized glucose load administered in the morning produces a blood glucose response roughly 30 to 40% higher than the same load administered in the afternoon in the same individuals. The clock-dependent difference in tissue sensitivity is that significant. When you eat at 7 a.m., you are sending a meal timing signal to peripheral tissues, your liver, your muscles, your gut, that are still in the closing phase of their nighttime program. Their enzymatic machinery for glucose disposal, Bile acid secretion and nutrient absorption has not reached its daytime peak. You are asking a factory to run full production during the shift changeover. Research from the Salk Institute, led by circadian biologist Sachidananda Panda, has translated this molecular understanding into practical outcomes in human subjects. In a 2020 study published in Cell Metabolism, Wilkinson and colleagues placed adults with metabolic syndrome on a 10-hour eating window, without any instruction to change what they ate, only when, and observed reductions in fasting blood glucose, average blood pressure reductions of 5 points, and body weight reductions averaging 3% over 12 weeks. No dietary overhaul, no calorie counting, no new foods, only the window. There is a measurement your doctor may track called hemoglobin A1C, sometimes written HbA1c, which reflects your average blood glucose over approximately 3 months by measuring how much glucose has attached to red blood cells. Glucose attaches to proteins throughout the body in a process called glycation, and glycated proteins are damaged proteins. The same chemistry that produces the brown crust on bread in an oven, a version of the Maillard reaction, is what happens to your blood vessel walls, your joint tissue, and your lens proteins when blood glucose runs chronically elevated. The resulting damaged structures are called advanced glycation end products, and they accumulate over time, stiffening arterial walls, degrading collagen, impairing cellular communication, and contributing to the biological texture of aging tissue. Every morning, insulin overshoot from an ill-timed breakfast is depositing a small contribution to that cumulative damage. For women specifically, the post-60 period introduces a hormonal dynamic that significantly narrows the margin for error. After menopause, the loss of estrogen removes a layer of metabolic protection that most women were unaware they had. Estrogen actively enhances insulin sensitivity. It helps maintain the responsiveness of insulin receptors, particularly in muscle tissue, and it influences fat distribution, keeping adipose tissue preferentially in subcutaneous locations rather than in the visceral, organ surrounding region. When estrogen declines, insulin sensitivity drops, fat redistributes toward the visceral compartment, and the inflammatory output of that fat tissue increases substantially. All of this occurs on top of the age-related sarcopenia and circadian blunting already described. For women post-menopause, the cortisol-insulin collision of an early breakfast is hitting a system that has lost a major buffer. The biological tolerance for mistimed eating is narrower than it was a decade ago, which is part of why metabolic changes after 60 often feel sudden and disproportionate to any obvious behavioral change. Now let me address what is happening in your body between 10 in the morning and noon after a typical early breakfast, because this is the window most people spend completely unaware of its metabolic significance. Insulin has partially cleared. Blood glucose is returning toward baseline, or has already dipped below it in a reactive pattern. Your body is beginning to search for its next fuel source. In a body that has not been flooded with an early meal, something specific would be happening in this window. Insulin would remain low. Glucagon, insulin's counterpart hormone, which tells the body to mobilize stored energy, would be rising. The enzyme hormone-sensitive lipase would be active. Fat cells would be releasing stored fatty acids into circulation to serve as fuel. This is the metabolic state your body is designed to inhabit every single morning. It is not starvation, it is not deprivation. It is the default operating mode of human metabolism, the one our physiology ran on for the entirety of evolutionary history before refrigerated breakfast products made eating at dawn both convenient and culturally mandatory. But if you ate at 7, insulin is not low in this window. The fat-burning phase never opens. Your body stays locked in glucose dependency, and glucose dependency maintained chronically is the central metabolic driver of what researchers now call inflammaging, the slow, low-grade, systemic inflammatory state that accelerates biological aging and underlies cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cognitive decline, and many age-related cancers. The visceral fat tissue that accumulates as a consequence of chronically elevated insulin is not passive storage. It is metabolically active in a way that perpetuates the problem. Visceral fat cells, the ones packed around your abdominal organs rather than sitting under your skin, produce signaling molecules called adipokines, including tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 6, and dysregulated leptin, that chronically activate the immune system's inflammatory pathways. This is like leaving a low flame burning under a pot 24 hours a day. The pot never boils. The inflammation never reaches a level where you feel acutely sick, but the continuous heat is degrading the pot itself, year by year, in ways that show up eventually as arterial stiffness, impaired glucose tolerance, elevated cardiovascular risk, and measurably accelerated biological age. This is the part one want to be precise about, because the fear has to translate into agency rather than just alarm. This does not mean your morning breakfast is going to produce a crisis tomorrow, but it does mean the pattern is creating a biological environment that makes everything harder: fat loss harder, inflammation harder to resolve, cardiovascular risk harder to manage than it needs to be. After 60, you have less biological buffer than you had at 40, which means that interventions that cost you nothing except timing produce a proportionally larger benefit than they would have earlier in life. I want to address the psychology of this change because biology alone does not explain why so many intelligent people understand this research and still eat breakfast at 7:15. And I know this from personal experience, not theory. I had read every paper my husband put in front of me. I understood the cortisol collision mechanism. I had bookmarked the Salk Institute research. I kept eating my morning yogurt anyway because the habit of morning eating is not purely biological, it is environmental, social, and identity linked. Breakfast is how many of us were taught to start a day correctly. It is tied to childhood rituals, family structure, and the idea that being responsible means fueling up before you face the world. Breaking a breakfast habit is not the same as intellectually accepting new data. It requires restructuring what is on the counter, what is in the refrigerator, and what you do with the first hour of the morning instead of eating. And it requires having a specific protocol for the transition period, because days 4 through 8 of any significant habit change are neurologically difficult in a way that general motivation completely fails to address. Here is the uncomfortable admission. My husband had put this together years before I actually followed it. He had spent 2 years deep in metabolic research after his aneurysm and the elevated cholesterol that blindsided both of us. And when he built something structured out of what he found, I treated it like a pamphlet rather than a tool. He did not argue with me. He refined it instead, building it into a 30-day daily companion called the Noon Reset Protocol. 2 pages per day. 1 page of the science behind what is happening in your body that specific day. 1 page of a practical tracker so you never have to generate the discipline of figuring out what today's objective is from scratch. The reason it is structured day by day rather than as a general overview is exactly what I described. Day 4 feels nothing like day 14, and a protocol that does not account for the specific challenge of each phase is not a protocol, it is an intention. It moves through 4 phases: adaptation, activation, optimization, and acceleration. And what finally got me to use it properly was the breakfast meal section. 25 specific first meal ideas with exact protein counts. Because the protein piece is not optional, and most women over 60 are chronically undereating it in ways that accelerate the very muscle loss that drives insulin resistance. The guide is available through the link in the description for less than dinner out, and I mention it here not as a commercial break, but because the gap between understanding a mechanism and having a usable daily structure for acting on it is genuinely where most people get stuck, including me, for longer than I should have been. Now back to the cellular level, because there is one mechanism in this story that deserves more attention than it typically gets outside of specialized research circles. Yoshinori Osumi won the 2016 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his detailed work on autophagy, the process by which cells identify and dismantle their own damaged components, recycle the usable molecular material, and use it to rebuild functional structures. Think of autophagy as your cell's internal quality control department. It identifies broken machinery, worn out mitochondria, misfolded proteins, oxidized membrane components, and runs them through a recycling process that extracts usable parts and clears the damaged remainder. It is your body's maintenance crew, and it runs most efficiently in a fasted state. When insulin is low, autophagy and insulin are in opposition via the mTOR pathway. When insulin is elevated, mTOR, the cellular growth and building pathway, is active. When mTOR is active, autophagy is suppressed. This trade-off is appropriate. When food is arriving, the body builds. When food is absent, the body repairs and recycles. The problem emerges when you are eating frequently, starting early in the morning and continuing until late evening, because you are keeping mTOR active for the majority of your waking hours and leaving autophagy with a very narrow window to operate. After 60, the efficiency of autophagy naturally declines. Damaged cellular components accumulate faster than they are cleared. Mitochondria that are worn out or malfunctioning are not recycled efficiently, and dysfunctional mitochondria produce excess reactive oxygen species, chemically unstable molecules that damage DNA, cell membranes, and proteins through a process called oxidative stress. Dysfunctional mitochondrial autophagy specifically is now considered one of the central mechanisms in the biology of aging itself and in the pathology of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. When you extend your fasted window by shifting your first meal to 10 or 11 in the morning, you give autophagy a 16 to 17-hour operational window. In the final 4 to 6 hours of that window, with insulin low and glucagon rising, autophagy runs at its most productive rate. You are not just burning fat during those hours. You are running cellular quality control that your body physically cannot run while it is processing an incoming meal. Eating at 7 a.m. closes that window prematurely, every morning by approximately 3 to 4 hours. That is not a trivial compression. Over a year, it represents more than 1,000 hours of reduced cellular maintenance time. The gut microbiome adds another layer to this timing story, and it is one that gets almost no attention in the context of breakfast habits specifically. After 60, the diversity of the gut microbiome naturally declines. Fewer bacterial species means reduced production of short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, which is the primary fuel for the cells lining your colon, and a potent anti-inflammatory molecule that influences immune regulation systemically. But urate-producing bacteria are particularly sensitive to disruption of the feeding-fasting cycle. Research published in Cell by Theis and colleagues at the Weizmann Institute showed that disrupting the timing of food intake, specifically eating consistently outside the body's circadian expectation for feeding, reduces the normal oscillation of microbial populations that allows different bacterial species to cycle through dominance at different times of day. When these oscillations are disrupted chronically, gut barrier integrity is compromised. Bacterial fragments called lipopolysaccharides, components of gram-negative bacterial cell walls, enter the bloodstream through a loosened intestinal lining and activate the innate immune system's primary inflammatory trigger, toll-like receptor 4. The result is a measurable state of systemic low-grade inflammation, visible in blood markers like high-sensitivity C-reactive protein and interleukin-6. This is one of the primary biological mechanisms feeding the inflammaging process. And it traces back, mechanistically, to eating outside the circadian feeding window, which is exactly what a 7 a.m. breakfast in a body whose digestive circadian machinery has not yet opened for the day represents. When you align your eating window to start later and end earlier, you restore the gut microbiome's fasting oscillation. Butyrate-producing bacteria complete their cycle. The intestinal barrier repairs during the overnight fasted window. The influx of lipopolysaccharides into circulation drops. The inflammatory signal from your gut quiets, not because you changed what you ate, but because you changed when you ate and gave the microbial ecosystem the fasted period it requires to maintain its own structural integrity. Now, the noon reset. 3 components, specific numbers, and one critical mistake that invalidates the protocol if ignored. The first component is the window. Your eating window begins no earlier than 10 in the morning and ends no later than 7 in the evening. This 9-hour window is more generous than the aggressive 8-hour or 6-hour windows studied in some research, while still delivering a minimum 15-hour fasted period overnight. The 10 a.m. entry point is not arbitrary. By 10 in the morning, the cortisol awakening response has resolved in most adults. Insulin sensitivity is climbing. The circadian regulated enzyme systems in your liver, gut, and muscle tissue are approaching their morning peak of readiness. You are beginning to eat at the leading edge of your body's optimal processing window, not during its morning recovery phase. If 10 a.m. is too aggressive as a starting point, begin at 9. Give yourself 2 weeks before pushing the window further, because the ghrelin signaling that drives morning hunger does adapt and recalibrate, but it takes 10 to 14 days, not 3. The second component is the break-fast meal. Your first meal must contain a minimum of 35 to 40 grams of complete protein paired with a non-starchy vegetable source. The protein floor comes from the anabolic resistance data. Older adults require approximately 40% more of the key amino acid leucine to generate the same muscle protein synthesis response that a smaller dose produces in a younger body. This is documented in multiple meta-analyses of protein metabolism in aging adults, including a comprehensive analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2016. A single egg contains approximately 6 grams of protein. A 2-egg omelet delivers 12. That is not 35 to 40 grams. A meal built around 5 to 6 eggs or 6 ounces of salmon, or a substantial serving of Greek yogurt supplemented with additional protein, begins to approach the threshold where the anabolic signal is strong enough to matter. The vegetable requirement is functional. Fermentable fiber from leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, or avocado feeds butyrate-producing gut bacteria during the window when they are most receptive, reinforcing the intestinal barrier integrity you spent the overnight fast allowing to recover. The third component is the post-meal walk. Within 60 to 90 minutes of your breakfast meal, while blood glucose is still climbing toward its postprandial peak, take a 15 to 20-minute walk at a pace where conversation requires noticeable effort, but sustained speech is still possible. This window is precise because muscular contraction during the glucose rise activates a second pathway for glucose uptake into muscle cells that operates independently of insulin, mediated by GLUT4 transporters stimulated by the mechanical work of movement rather than by hormonal signal. In a body where insulin signaling is already compromised by age-related receptor desensitization, this secondary pathway is a meaningful metabolic tool. It blunts the glucose spike, reduces the compensatory insulin overshoot, shortens the fat-locked state, and does all of this without placing any additional burden on a pancreas that is already working harder than it should. The single mistake that invalidates this entire protocol is treating the delayed first meal as an opportunity to eat less overall. This is a critical distinction, and it is where many people misapply this approach. The noon reset is not a caloric restriction strategy. It is a timing and composition optimization. If you shift your eating window and simultaneously undereat, particularly if you undereat protein, you accelerate sarcopenia, which is the exact biological mechanism that worsens insulin resistance, increases visceral fat, and drives accelerated aging. The goal is not less food. It is the right food at the right time in a composition that matches the biological readiness of your system. Total daily protein after 60 should be in the range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, based on current research in muscle physiology, significantly above the government's current recommended daily allowance, which was calculated largely from studies of younger adults and has not been updated to reflect the anabolic resistance data of the past decade. For a 140-pound woman, that is roughly 80 to 100 grams of protein per day, distributed across 2 to 3 meals that each individually meet the minimum threshold for stimulating muscle protein synthesis, not spread thinly across 6 small snacks that each deliver an amount too modest to register. None of this is complicated. All of it requires understanding a mechanism that most mainstream nutrition advice shaped by industry interests, built on outdated research and largely unchanged since the 1970s, has either ignored or actively worked to obscure. The morning yogurt at 7:15 is not health-conscious behavior with minor limitations. It is behavior shaped by an industry that profited from your 7 a.m. cortisol spike, embedded in a cultural story about breakfast that was built partly on funded science, colliding every day with a hormonal environment that makes it genuinely costly. And that cost compounds quietly in your vascular tissue, your muscle mass, your gut microbiome, your overnight repair window, and the cumulative glycation damage building in your blood vessels. You now know the mechanism. The mechanism is the part that actually changes behavior because willpower exhausts itself eventually, but understanding why a pattern costs you something specific and biological does not fade the same way. If you are going to start the noon reset this week, comment window open below so I can see who is actually doing this. And subscribe, because I read the research papers with the tedious titles so you do not have to, and there is considerably more inside those papers worth knowing about.